Welcome back, everybody. So this is lesson 2, Science of Political Economy, basically going through George's book of the same name. I thought I would start, somebody suggested, I was talking to after last week, that maybe not everybody here knows how well known George was, but if that's wrong, then I won't go through a little spiel about it, because then you'll all groan and say, we know. But, all right, so in case people are not aware, and I think most of you probably are, George was really well known in his day. Progress and Poverty sold in the millions of copies. That was his seminal work. More than many a bestseller in his day and even today. It was translated into French, Spanish, German, Dutch, Hungarian, Swedish, Russian, and Chinese. Speaking and writing further about his ideas, he attracted a number of people, including prominent people like Tolstoy, Sun Yat-sen, who's a rare example of a statesman that both the People's Republic of China and Taiwan admire, the young Winston Churchill, the young Clarence Darrow, who began his public speaking career at a George rally, and the young George Bernard Shaw. The ones I mentioned young, they veered away from George later in life, but he was quite the stir. That's just a brief thing for those who may not know that. And he's not nearly as well known to the public today. So I thought I would start by giving you the 1 or 2 or 3 line summary of what we did last week. And then we'll get into, tonight is about the production of wealth. So just the extremely short version of last week, George defines the science of political economy as the investigation of the nature of wealth and the production and distribution of wealth in social or civilized life. So that's what he's talking about. And the laws that the science of political economy seeks to discover are universal or natural laws, meaning in part that politics actually doesn't enter into the laws he's trying to discover and talk about. If he succeeds by his own setting of his goals, he will be uncovering laws that would apply regardless of form of government, particular nationality, and geography. And in a way, laws that obtain regardless of the overlay of legislation that is aimed at the economy. I won't go into that more. We talked about that a bit last week. And then finally, he defines wealth as natural products, so secured, altered, moved, or combined, or that kind of thing, as to fit them for the satisfaction of human desires. So one thing I wanted to just pick up that I meant to cover last week, and I promised whoever asked about, is there morality or lack thereof in economics? It seems like there might be a lack of morality. I thought I would just mention one point before we get to the production of wealth, which is when he's still in Book 2, talking about the nature of wealth, George points out that the human desires that people seek wealth in order to satisfy, political economy doesn't, as he says, concern itself with the goodness or badness of those desires. A gun that's used for hunting or sports is as much wealth as a gun that might be used for terrorism or homicide. And that sounds pretty amoral, but let me read you a quote about that from the Science of Political Economy. He says, for the principle that men always seek to satisfy their desires with the least exertion, which is a major principle in his science, there has been substituted, from the time that political economy began to claim the attention of thoughtful men, the principle of human selfishness. And with the assumption that political economy takes into its account only the selfish feelings of human nature, there have been linked as laws of political economy other assumptions as destitute of validity. So he doesn't side with those who say that selfishness is what lies behind political economy and economic actions. He goes on, to show how completely the idea has prevailed that the foundation of political economy is the assumption of human selfishness. He says, I'm not going to talk about writers of his day who were found political economy repugnant so much that it has the science or the subject has been with justice styled the dismal science. So he says, I'm not going to talk about Carlyle, Dickens, or Ruskin, but I'll talk about Buckle, who also basically feels that selfishness is key. Yet, he says, however, generally the accepted writers on political economy may themselves have supposed the assumption of universal selfishness to be the fundamental principle of political economy, or how much ground they may have given for such a supposition on the part of their readers, a true political economy requires no such assumption. The primary postulate on and from which its whole structure is built is not that all men are governed only by selfish motives, or must for its purposes be considered as governed only by selfish motives. It is that all men seek to gratify their desires, whatever those desires may be, with the least exertion. And he concludes by saying, it is true that good and evil are not in external things or in their laws of action, but in will or spirit. So 2 comments I just wanted to pick up and make about that. One is that, as George says, the type of desire that lies behind the desire for wealth or the production of wealth is not important to the science of political economy. And on the other hand, you can hardly turn anywhere in George's writings without coming up against the fact that he is extremely interested in justice and injustice and is an advocate for the eradication of injustice. So morality, he's really kind of all about morality. So just throw both of those things out there. It may sound, and it does sound kind of contradictory, but that is not to say then that George sides with those who feel that selfishness is the motive behind the production of wealth. I have a little aside. I mean, can anybody think of any writers that are sort of popular today who may not be around anymore, but you'll read about them in recent news and stuff that are kind of admired for their philosophy of selfishness? Yes? Thank you. I was ready to give the first name, but yeah, thank you very much. I'll pay you later. Yes, and Ayn Rand, I mean, it's been years since I read Ayn Rand, but I know that she sort of popularized her sort of thumbnail catchphrase is, greed is good. So I just want to throw in my 2 cents about that. I'm gonna go with, no, greed is not good. I think greed is infantile. Greed is what we start with when we are infants. And as we grow and we mature, we grow out of it. I think that Rand has been used by her admirers as a license and a rationale for ruthlessness. You may disagree, maybe that's not always true, but it's easy for me to look at it that way. There was an article in a recent New Yorker about Rex Tillerson. He's an admirer, and it's a kind of a balanced piece in the New Yorker, but it does portray somebody who doesn't have too cozy a relationship with sticking to the truth. Anyway, I saw your hand, so go ahead. You were going to say something.
I was going to say, the synonym for greed these days is shareholder value.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's another perspective, and gives it, I think, that's more euphemistic sounding than greed.
Well, that's fine.
Yeah, that's
Warm and fuzzy word.
That's from the PR people who are in favor of the greed brand, I guess. Go ahead. What?
How do you look at that when you say that phrase that you said that a human being wants to make wants to do less work, but yet achieve?
Right, but George doesn't see that as synonymous with greed. That's just the way he regards how we produce wealth. I mean, nobody, if you want to produce any article of wealth, you want to get an apple that you can eat, you want to pick up Chinese food for dinner, whatever it is you're looking to do, it's kind of a universal rule that if you can do it with less effort, you're going to take that road. You're not going to go out of your way to work harder to get what the wealth you want. Yeah.
How do you compare that to someone that decides to have an investment into something that you don't have to really do any work, but then you can receive the fee?
Well, I mean, I think probably everybody in this room, if we were able to get $20 back from 10 without much effort, we would be attracted to that. Yeah. I don't want to go further into this. I just wanted to introduce that but I have another quick digression before we get into the production of wealth, which is when I was in law school, the dean of Boston College Law School was a man named Daniel Cocolette. In his day, he had clerked for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a very impressive guy, kind of stoop-shouldered from all the reading he did. And he told us one day in a seminar I took with him, this is about cheating, that he was in Boston, which happens all the time. He was sitting in traffic, a line of cars that was going nowhere through the streets of Boston. And you've all experienced this if you've done any driving or been in a car. Somebody zooms along the side of the line and then cuts in a couple of cars ahead. And Cocolette, I ascribe this to the fact that he had a Quaker upbringing. I don't know if that's true, but I picture that. He gets out of his car, which he could do because the cars weren't going anywhere, and he calmly walks up to where the guy has cut in, and the guy rolls down his window, and Cocolette says to him, you can only do that because the rest of us are patiently waiting our turn. So the point I want to make here is that cheating, which comes up occasionally in George, the prerequisite for cheating is that most people do not cheat. And it may be that personally I've kind of had the wrong attitude towards cheating. I get angry when I see someone cutting in line, but it occurs to me that maybe, especially in this day and age where there's more stress everywhere, maybe the greater philosophical insight should be that there aren't more people who cut in line. So, okay, that as a sort of further reflection on Ayn Rand. So over to production of wealth. When George starts to talk about it, first, as he often does, he sort of plays a little with where did the word production come from, and he notices that it's basically derived from either the Latin or the Greek, I forget which, a drawing forth. And in his case, he talks in many of his writings about there being three basic factors in the world for the production of wealth: land, labor, and capital. Land being basically the natural substrate on which labor acts in order to produce wealth or a subset of wealth, capital. And he also, so the rest of his discussion, what we're going to cover before the break is some of his analyses. And after the break, we'll get to that and his masterful use of example with the sailing and building of a ship. But for now, we'll talk about different ways and sort of lenses that he looks at the production of wealth through, and each one of them is a little bit different conceptually, and they're all, I think, insightful. One thing he says early on is that there are essentially, as far as he's concerned, three basic types of production of wealth. He calls one adapting, another one growing, and another one exchanging. So examples might be for adapting, mining, taking ore out of the earth and adapting it, changing it chemically, smelting it, and so on. Another example of growing. Well, another example he assigns of adapting would be hunting. I guess you capture an animal and you kill it, and you've now adapted it to become food. Certainly, if you cook it, you're changing it, you're adapting it. Growing would be, agriculture, the growing of crops, the raising of animals and breeding of animals. taking advantage of the growth properties in nature. And exchanging, an example might be the exchange of goods in the marketplace. And actually, there can be many exchanges of different types of wealth in the production of complex articles of wealth. So he goes on to consider that, and this is a theme we'll come back to a bit later, that exchange, as far as George is concerned, is a part of the production of wealth and not of distribution. This is different from the view that a lot of other economists have. Basically, he regards that production of wealth includes transportation and exchange. And as I say, those are not considered by other economists to be part of production, but they believe it's part of distribution. But according to George, wealth production is not complete until the products are brought to the consumer. So if wealth is defined as natural objects, so secured, moved, modified, combined, etc., as to better fit them for the satisfaction of human desires, that process, George observes, is not complete in a society that has more than one individual until those objects are brought to the consumer. I have this bottle of water. It's a different one than I had last week, in case you're keeping track. But, I mean, if it's in a number, there probably were a number of warehouse places that it was stored in getting to me from, at least they claim, Maine. And if it still sits in those warehouses, I have no access to it, and so it has no ability to satisfy my human desire to have a drink of water, which I'll do right now, just to demonstrate. And that's how we do that, yes?
But it's also a brand that Nestle's owns.
It's also a brand that Nestle's owns.
Yeah.
If you follow tell me what...
You want me to follow up on that comment?
Well, you felt the need to just point that out, or did you have more behind that?
Talking about social justice and everything, and this is a firm that is trying to corner the market on water. That it's not a human right.
Okay, well, that sounds like a thing to come back to. That's interesting. Say again?
So is Coca-Cola.
Coca-Cola, okay.
Whereas Coca-Cola has sugar, water doesn't have sugar.
No. Coca-Cola has water on the table, which they all do.
Well, if I could.
Yes,
They all do it because it's the greatest. It's a great profit maker. Just take some city water, put it in a bottle, and sell it for like 10. You didn't pay anything for it to get it.
Boy, you're such a cynic.
It's not cynic. This is what happens.
But yeah, do you think that's all they do? Because I bought the Kool-Aid, so to speak.
It was already a company. They bought it.
Right, but I mean, I think it's sort of more purified and spring water.
No, this is spring water.
Right, it tastes different. Yeah, nothing against tap water, which is not bad. Right.
But I mean, if you're running for shareholder value,
right,
a business, it makes a lot more sense to use tap water instead of spring water.
Yeah, and if you can bottle it and sell it as something special.
bottle tap water.
Yeah, but they don't label it as spring water. This is labeled spring water. That's what it really is.
Yeah.
But the point is, you make more money. You make more money using tap water, which costs nothing, than you make if you have to go find a spring where it comes out of the earth. Mm-hmm. And then
But they also have.
How do they market it? They market it as tap water.
Filtered. Nestle market both. They market Poland Springs.
they market out everything they can buy.
Well, hold off. If I could just get back if I could relate all of this wisdom to what I was saying just a moment ago, the point here is that until it gets to where you can buy it, at least at a store, as far as George is concerned, production is not complete, and transportation is part of production. That's the only point I wanted to make. So I wanted to get on to,
Next week maybe you can do a cup of tea or something instead of water.
Okay, all right. I can see I'm causing problems with my bottle of water. Okay.
And same way, bring a banana into the apple.
Yeah. Actually was going to bring a piece of fruit, but I didn't find one that was thematically appropriate. I was going to bring a pluot because it's an example of cooperation between two different types of fruit. And we're going to be really the heart of today, when we get to it, it will be about cooperation and its role in production. But before we get there, George has, I think, an interesting number of observations about the role of space and time in production. I don't think he was trained rigorously as a scientist, but he was well-read and obviously interested in basic science. And so here he's considering, the roles that space first and that time play in the production of wealth. He gives an example first of agricultural production of wealth, beets. He takes beets. And the point he's making here, as he makes later on when he talks about bricks, is that initially, as you start to use space more efficiently for the production of wealth, by concentrating production in smaller spaces, you increase the efficiency of the production of wealth. If you take the example of beets, if you have them spread out pretty far, one beet from another, it will take that much longer for the cultivator to get to them, to water them, to harvest them. So you bring them together in the optimal, most efficient proximity to each other, and you can thereby produce more beets more easily. But once you go past a certain point and you crowd your beets, it starts to decrease their ability to grow to the point where if it's really concentrated, you may get next to no productivity. This is kind of significant when you compare George's observation to the Malthusian theory and also the sort of general theory that I think Mill espoused of diminishing returns, particularly in agriculture, that as population increases, although that's not specifically about space, the ability of people to produce agricultural products diminishes sort of per person. And George points out that that's not actually true. It's true past a certain point, but up to that point, greater concentration of production in space actually increases productivity. That's the main point I'm making there. He says it's not just true of, growing agricultural production of wealth. It's also true of adapting. Bricks, for example, he says. If you have a pile of bricks, you have a lot of bricks derived, I guess, from clay or inorganic substances, no growing needed. Part of the chain of using bricks in production is to store them for use in construction. And just taking this one little system of the storage of bricks, he points out that if you spread them out far from each other, it will be that much harder to store them, to gather them, to transport them. But so it's more efficient to start to use, to kind of stack them next to each other. And in fact, to then start stacking them vertically, it's a more efficient way. It's easier to grab them off the pile. But past a certain, so efficiency increases by concentrating inorganic wealth in space, in this example. But past a certain point, if you stack them too high, they're unstable, and the weight of the upper ones will start to crush the lower ones. So you can't do that ad infinitum. And that's his point about space. I had an example I thought of on the way over here, which is, I'm just sort of playing Henry George Jr., pretending I'm Henry George. It occurred to me, I used to work in film and video production. So the concept I have in mind is a control panel, whether it be for video editing or an airplane or a car even, your dashboard. There's a kind of an art and maybe a little bit of a science to ergonomics, which is to have all your gizmos arranged in a way that they're all ready to hand and not too spread out, so that you can conveniently get to them And you sort of get bonus points if you can arrange them in a way that's efficient to how you will need to use them operationally to edit video or to fly an airplane or to drive a car. And I think that's another example of the role of efficient use of space in satisfying our desires. So then he considers, which I think gets even to me a little more interesting, the role of time in the production of wealth, because it's not just about space. In order to adapt and secure and so on natural products to make them into wealth, there's also the element of time that's worth pausing over and considering. In the case of time, there are two sort of features, obviously. George reminds us that sequence is important. When you're making something, there is a sequence in which quite often you have to do things. And also there is an element of the duration of time that's needed to perform a given task. And he gives the example, which I think is a nice one, of a contractor who's hired to build a house. When you build a house, first you have to dig the foundations. You can't do that last. You lay the foundations, you build the structure on top of it, you frame it up, and only when that has happened and you have an interior can you start to do interior work, like put in the plumbing and the electrical wiring and so on. And you can't do it out of sequence. But he also points out that you can get more efficient in your use of time if you speed up your ability to perform tasks. You can get the thing done quicker, obviously. But he also points out that as with space, you can generally only do that to a point, and past that point you start to hurt your ability to produce wealth. So he gives the example of a contractor who is asked by a demanding customer, can you build me this house, twice as fast as you were going to, or build it for me in a matter of weeks rather than months. And the contractor, as George points out, to a point will say, well, look, if you can pay me more so I can hire more crew, so we can get these things done faster, maybe I hire more skilled people, then I can reduce the amount of time that it takes me to build you a house. But as George points out, once you get below a certain amount of time, how does he put it? He says, below that minimum amount of time to do it right, no matter how many people you have and how skilled they are, below that amount of time, a builder would rightly say, I don't care how much you pay me, the thing is impossible. And I sort of like to think about this in terms of my work. To me, it's a bit of an insight, even though I've been doing legal work as an immigration lawyer for decades now. I sense this because operationally I live this, but it's true that when you try to, you have a kind of a flexible time scale that you can do a given task with legal work as well as other work. It may take you longer or shorter. You can speed things up. But once you get below a certain amount of time, and it's taken me years to really appreciate this, you start to hurt your ability to produce a decent product. You don't proofread something. Typographical errors have a mind of their own and will creep in. You may forget to update something, and that may have an effect on what you're sending in. If I'm doing a visa application, so I can, if I'm under deadline and I have work pressure and workload pressure, I can and I'm forced to speed up my output. But if it gets below a certain amount of time, it can't be done. It can't be done right. You start to really take risk. And below even that point, you're better off saying, no, I can't do this. And I mean, you can get into situations where you have to and you can't, and that you try to anticipate them by spreading out the time on the front end, so you don't end up with a crunch that you can't handle. Another little digression, before we get into the area of cooperation, which is that, again, I've noticed in my business that there are different types of labor that involves the use of time, which I guess it all does, can be have different factors that make it more or less burdensome. And they don't all have to do with the amount of time that it takes you to do them. There's also the quality of the work, the things that go into making a given hour that I might work in my office pleasant or unpleasant or almost unbearable are things like, is it a rush job, which can take a leisurely kind of fun task and turn it into something really unpleasant? Are the stakes really high? Is it a really pressured case? Is this a matter of, well, if this doesn't work out, we can try something else? Or is it, as in one case I had where a client was detained in immigration jail and ready to be shipped back to his home in his country of origin in Central America, where he would probably be killed by the drug gangs that had kidnapped him into the U.S. That was pressure. I felt that pressure. So you're really trying to get it right. And that makes that work harder. If it's more complex, if you're dealing with unpleasant officials or sometimes unpleasant clients, all of those things can make a given hour that you're working more or less burdensome. And the same is true for all kinds of work. So I thought, just on the subject of the unpleasantness of rushing, I thought I'd try a little experiment here. So what I think, let's do this quickly. Why don't we go around the room and try for people taking turns to say your first name, but we don't have to be totally alphabetical about it, but if there's anybody with A's, let's go through the alphabet reciting names. So all of the A's should go before any of the B's or C's. Let's just do that. If you know, do we have any A's here? Anybody first name start with an A? Okay, go on to B. You know, so who thinks that they have any B's, C's, D's? First names. Okay, go ahead. What's your first name?
My name is Diego.
Diego. Okay. Any other D's? Oh, go ahead. Say your name. Karen. Diego. Any D's? We're done with the D. E's? Just go with it. No? All right. What's F? Go ahead. Fred. Any other? G? Do I hear a G? H? I? Hi. Okay. I'm going to guess Ibrahima. You look like an Ibrahima. J? I bet I know there's J's. Go ahead. Jeanette. K? L? No L's. M? There's got to be an M. All right. Michael. N. Okay. N? Who's an N? Nina. Go ahead. Mirna. Okay, fine. Okay. N-O? Olaf. P? Q? That would be weird. R? Ralph. Roberto. QRS? Sandy. And? Sue. T? Steve. T? U? V? W? William. X? Any Xaviers here? Y? Z? Okay. All right. That's fine. Now we had no time pressure. Now let's try to do that in I'm going to say 30 seconds. Okay? So let's start. Who is the C? C's. Say your name. Okay. D's. Keep going. Okay. K. Jeffrey. L. M. N. Say your name. O. P. Q. R. S. Steve. U. V. W. Okay. That's it. Well, that wasn't a great demonstration, but if there was pressure on you because if you failed, you would be fined like $10 each. What's that? I think it was over 30. You didn't make it. No, that's all right. Just the point is that the same thing, which is kind of a walk through the park. If you could take your time, if you have to do it really fast, it can be stressful. I mean, I know we all have. Anybody who's ever had to rush to make an appointment knows that's not as much fun as a leisurely walk. You're running late, you're stressed. Okay, so that's my brilliant point here. I can cross that off.
You gotta give yourself time.
Yeah, right. Otherwise, you start to even have health problems. Okay. So now on to we'll work our way through the first things that George has to say about cooperation in the production of wealth. That's the heart of tonight. And then we'll get to the wonderful example of the sailing ship. So one of the sort of grids or dichotomies that he uses to look at how cooperation between people is used to enhance our ability as a society to produce wealth is, on the one hand, the combination or multiplication of labor, and on the other hand, the separation or division of labor. So by combination, his point is that, in this way, it's possible to have individuals who join together to, in effect, make themselves into one larger person to do what nobody could do individually. And he gives the example of moving a heavy rock or raising a log, or what used to be done, I guess still is somewhere, log rolling, heavy logs. And he uses a sort of physical analogy. It's similar to using a crowbar where you get leverage from the fact that many people are working on this. So you're able to move a larger mass in a shorter distance or take a longer time doing it. And so that's one, he calls these, ways of cooperation, ways that people cooperate to produce wealth. He gives, he talks about the separation of effort, which we're very familiar with as the division of labor, and that's similar to, it's as if individuals who are working together could divide themselves into a number of smaller people. He gives a nice illustration of an example of Tom, Dick, Harry, and Jim, who work in a new settlement on the frontier, and they find they're doing various local chores, but they also need to get supplies from a village that's 2 days away. He points out that if they just assign one of their number to go do the errand for all of them, and he takes 2 days to do that, and while he's doing that, each of the other three do half a day's work for the guy who goes on the trip for them. If you work out the math, and this is the kind of thing that takes me a while, it turns out that for all of them together, each one of them saves 1.5 days and over what it would have taken them each 4 days to do if they hadn't divided up their tasks that way. So they have one guy specializing in running the errand, and collectively they all get the same amount of work done in significantly less time, all four of them. So that's like a classic example of the division of labor.
Like, just like
yeah.
Ford was able to do manufacturing for cars.
Right, assembly line production, and you're able to bang out and produce those cars in far greater quantity than you could have, or much faster than you could have before. So, he points out a number of things that arise out of that. The division of labor allows, the primary savings is it allows you to get equal results with less effort or greater results with the same amount of effort. But out of that, there are other savings that he talks about, and he uses an analogy. So, tonight, where last week we talked about definition and that kind of thing, tonight we'll get into a little bit of, I think, George's very powerful use of illustrative, well-chosen example. and also analogy. And in this case, he uses, I think, a nice analogy from naval architecture. He says, consider the fact that a ship or a boat, a nautical vessel, is longer than it is wide. And the reason is that it takes energy for a boat to overcome water resistance, particularly in the direction it's moving. That's why you have a tapered bow. And that you, by putting, more, in effect, more ships behind the first one, it takes less effort to move that through the water than it would take to move them all if they all had to break through the water. He also uses the analogy of, it's as if you have two people carrying loads through one hole in a wall. That's a lot more efficient than if each one had to make their own hole. It's very similar to that. And he also uses the example of baking bread. If you could have people working in shifts, if you do that, you can continuously keep the oven at a temperature, at a baking temperature, where you only have to heat it up to that temperature using that extra fuel to do that one time. It's easier enough to keep it at a temperature, and you don't lose fuel letting it cool down and having to reheat it. It's a more efficient way to produce bread. So, and he points out that the savings that are made by concentration of work arise not only from physical laws, but from mental laws as well. And here he talks about, the advantages of specialization. The efficiency, he says, of the productive power of man that comes from differentiation of functions is increased to a degree to which we can assign no limits, and of which the marvelous increase in productive power which so strikingly characterizes our modern civilization affords but a faint forecast. He also says that in civilized society, the division of labor is so extensive and we're so used to it, it's hard to realize how much we owe to it. And he assigns and observes that there are different types of savings and increases in efficiency that come from the division of labor. For example, you can utilize the different strengths and abilities of different people, which capitalizes on, it sort of maximizes the collective ability to produce wealth. If one of you is really physically powerful, to have them do sort of physical tasks, and another person is really gifted at sort of mathematical things. Maybe they'd be better off as an engineer than the guy who is physically strong, and so on. So if you play to different people's strengths, the net overall result is greater than if everybody had to do a bit of everything. And similarly, by specializing, people get to be more skilled, and they get to be more efficient, and they get to be more knowledgeable in doing things. You also, through specialization, get to do things on a greater scale, like the example with the Ford assembly plant, and that brings into play the possibility of inventing machinery that can do repetitive tasks, and that also enhances the ability of society to produce wealth. Yeah, go ahead.
What is his definition of efficiency?
I don't know. I mean, I think he just uses it in the common way. What I understand that George would understand by efficiency, I don't remember him bothering to define it, is just, that's my shorthand. It's not his word, but I think the concept floats in his writing. It's basically greater efficiency in the production of wealth means either of two things, either or both. One is that you can produce the same amount of wealth with less effort, or with the same amount of effort that you put in before, you can produce a greater amount of wealth. It's just a very functional, sort of mechanical use of the word efficiency. I wouldn't get too hung up on it. I mean, it may be that I use it more than he does, but he uses the word too. It's just functionally very valuable to discuss what advantages there comes to be from the cooperation of people working together in unison. You can, as a group, you can do things that you can't, that the collective, each person as an individual, in some cases would be physically unable to do, and in other cases, you can do them with much greater effectiveness, and even start to produce things that would be impossible if everybody had to do everything on their own. And I mean, in this room, you have examples of that on your bot. If you had to grow the cotton, and you had to put the time in to, harvest it and then weave it into thread and make it into your shirt and dye it and design it and sew it all together. And you had to do that for every article of wealth that you have. And we all had to do that. It would take us so long to do that some things we couldn't even produce, and other things that we also use our time to do, we wouldn't have time to do. So, and that's basically just a simple feature of life in society, in civilization.
Well, I asked that because the word today can be used very harshly
It can be used sort of impersonally and inhumanly, like it's all about efficiency. But that's not the point I want to get at. I mean, that is a good point, but that's not what I'm getting at here. Yes, go ahead. You had a question.
Like we had coal mining for one thing, we had gold rushes another thing.
Right.
And those people, there were times when they were going for themselves.
Right.
Especially with the gold rush.
Right.
The miners for gold.
Right.
Now, I don't know too much about the coal mining.
Right.
I do know there were problems with that when the caves would collapse and things like that.
Right.
Well, there still are. There are still mine collapses. So yeah, unfortunately, that has continued. I mean, you would think that it would be less dangerous as technology has presumably learned from disasters in the past, but they do still sometimes happen. So I just want to take a moment, and then we'll take a break, and then, my friends, then we will get to the ship. Okay, so stay tuned. I know I'm really being sneaky to dangle this in front of you, but yeah, we're all gonna.
Is that
Right.
your goal?
That is, yes. That is the yeah. I'm trying to think of the name. For the name of my boat escapes me. That's the SS Mnemonic. Okay, whatever. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. So just before we take a break, let's just, if anybody, as the Spirit moves you, if you want to say either what type of field or industry you either work in now or have ever worked in, just so we can get a number of industries sort of on the table. I mean, I worked in film and video production, and now I work in legal work, providing legal services. Anybody want to mention some area that they've worked in that's different from mine? Anybody? Go ahead, Sue.
I worked in technology for 35 years.
Specifically, what kind of technology?
IBM mainframes, building business systems.
Okay. Wow, that's a mouthful. I'm impressed. Okay. Anything else? Any sort of construction trades? Yeah, go ahead.
Welding.
Welding? Good.
Refrigeration system.
Say again?
Refrigeration system.
Okay. HVAC or?
Oil.
Okay. All right. Anyone else want to throw something out there that they've done? Service industry? Oh, say it. Go ahead.
I was a designer for babies' clothes.
Okay. Clothing designer. Anything else? Let's get some variety here. Somebody? Yes, go ahead.
Marketing and advertising.
Marketing and advertising. Okay.
Funding.
Yes.
Yeah, jewelry, import, manufacture, and wholesale.
Okay. All right. Good. I mean, so I don't want to stop you if anybody wants to chime in, but that's a good variety. So I mean, just to pause for a second over that and consider really how different those specializations are. I'm going to guess. Correct me if I'm wrong. If this is like kind of just making assumptions, but I'm going to guess that you're probably not like a super expert on refrigeration or welding. I'm just going to throw that. Is that unfair? No, I'm talking about this guy.
No, it could be if you want me. Give me a month.
Okay, all right, but if I were to just like bring you something and say, here, could you please weld this? I assume you'd have to at least look something up to figure out how to do it. Okay, and similarly, the gentleman in the back, if you had to do, I don't know, if you had to do, mainframe hardware technology architecture, it would be a challenge, right? I mean, you probably want to, okay, it's probably not much different from plumbing, things flow, but still, so the point being that all of these things that, we draw upon to navigate the city and live our lives, in modern life, in this area of the world and many, specialization allows us to function, and be productive in ways that we couldn't be without it. And that's a feature that comes along with even the most primitive societies. As societies sort of develop, that's a natural tendency. And George is sort of analyzing that in different ways. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the difference between the talk of George and Adam Smith say the same thing about the organization.
Yeah, there's not much disagreement about that. Yeah, but true. Go ahead.
I didn't understand the question.
I think what he was saying is that Diego, right?
No, Roberto.
Oh, Roberto. You're Diego. Okay. Wow. It'd be interesting to test me on all this. But let's not do that. Okay. So, Roberto, I think what Roberto was saying, hola? Okay. Is that it doesn't seem, unlike some of the other points I've raised tonight and last time, it doesn't seem as if George's ideas differ that radically, especially on the idea of division of labor, from that of other economists. And all I'm saying is that's absolutely true. But, so we're going to take a break now, but when we get back into cooperation, there too, his ideas are not fundamentally and radically different from those of others, although I will say that they're, I think, a little more clever, sort of insightful, and go kind of deeper into the process of how cooperation specifically helps us produce wealth in a society. But they're not fundamentally or radically opposed to other ideas, except when you start to look at the sort of larger context in his thinking of the role that cooperation plays. Then there are some corollaries that show an interesting divergence from that of other economists. But again, we'll do that after the break, and hopefully we'll get the ship back up by then.
Sure.
Okay. All right, so why don't we take whatever amount of time?
10 minutes, that's reasonable.
Okay.